All right, this is going to be a copy of the presentation that I'm going to be giving at The Ohio State University later today. They wouldn't allow me to record the presentation within the classroom, so I'm just going to record the information in my garage and give the in-person lecture later this afternoon. So in regards to what the lecture is going to be about, it's going to be about the management of internal fluids. So whether in physical therapy curriculum or the exercise physiology curriculum, there's a great emphasis on muscles. What's the name of each muscle? What is the attachment sites of each muscle? How does a muscle's orientation change based on range of motion? Is the muscle fast twitch or slow twitch? What happens when the muscle shortens? What happens when the muscle lengthens? What class of lever is each muscle? While all these things are very important to know when coaching and prescribing exercise, it also neglects to consider the expansive elements involved in movement. And so that's what this lecture is going to cover, is the expansive rather than contractile elements of movement. So we often view the musculoskeletal system as a series of levers and pulleys. While I think this can be helpful to improve our understanding of specific muscles' functions, I do believe that the musculoskeletal system is best represented by what we call a tensegrity structure. And a tensegrity structure is a structure in which there are alternating elements of compression and tension. So this children's toy is actually a tensegrity structure. I'm going to move a little closer here. So you can see that there are rubber bands. These are the contractile elements of the toy. They're trying to pull everything closer together. Then there are wooden dowel rods. Those are the expansive or the tensile elements of the tensegrity structure. And these wooden dowel rods are pushing the ends of the rubber band further apart. If we were to compare this toy to the structure of our musculoskeletal system, these rubber bands would be the muscles, and the wooden rods would be our bones, the bones keeping the attachment sites of the muscle far from one another. Now there are two large advantages to a tensegrity structure that I think suits the function of the musculoskeletal system very well. The first is that a tensegrity structure acts the same irrespective of gravity. So I can turn this toy on its side, I can flip the toy 180 degrees. Irrespective of gravity, it will always return back to this original shape. This is very similar to how the human body responds. We can maintain the same shape when we're standing on our feet, laying on our back, doing a handstand, or laying on our side. We can maintain the same shape regardless of the pull of gravity relative to our body orientation. The second advantage to a tensegrity structure is that force is uniformly distributed throughout the structure. So if I were to compress this toy from top to bottom, the force is uniformly distributed throughout the structure. This is very important when you consider that when humans run, jump, cut, we absorb 5, 6, 7, 8 times our body weight in ground reaction forces. The ability to uniformly distribute that force throughout the body is very important in regards to preventing and managing injuries. There have actually been a lot of studies done that when you consider the amount of load the human body absorbs and the fact that most muscles in the human body are class 3 levers, class 3 lever being where the resistance, the force is applied between the resistance and the fulcrum. these class 3 levers are not well suited for force production or force absorption. There have been studies that have actually looked at when the human body is absorbing that significant amount of force, that the muscles as class 3 levers would actually fail. So again, that lends some credence to our musculoskeletal system potentially looking more like a tensegrity structure rather than a series of levers and pulleys. So this is one example of a tensegrity structure. And in this model, the wooden dowel rods would represent the bones as the tensile elements of the tensegrity structure. In addition to bones, water and air are also expansive tensioning elements. So this is another example of a tensegrity structure. It was actually made where the top wooden disc would represent our pelvic diaphragm, the bottom wooden disc would represent, or the top wooden disc would represent our thoracic diaphragm, the bottom wooden disc would represent our pelvic diaphragm. These elastic wires would represent the abdominal muscles wrapping around our trunk, and then the balloon in the middle would be like the water or air within our torso. And so similar to the previous example, without any expansive elements, without the water or air housed within this balloon, the structure would simply collapse on itself. And this is one major reason why we need both compression and expansion in order for movement and shape change to occur. So this balloon represents the water in our guts, our organs being relatively solid, and then even the air within our lungs. These are all expansive elements housed within our trunk. So from viewing this model, you can see that the expansive elements, in this case the water or air within the balloon, resists movement, resists these two plates moving together. So as a general rule, something to consider is that fluid within the body, whether that's water or air, resists movement in that direction. So a common example would be like a strongman competitor who presses the circus dumbbell overhead. When you see the strongman competitor push that dumbbell overhead, you see them slightly side bend to the opposite side. While that side bend brings the weight closer to the middle of the base of support and also decreases the range of motion demands of the overhead lift, what that side bend also does is creates an area of high pressure on our left side in order to push water and air over to the right side of our chest, which creates a water and air column that actually helps support that weight overhead and resist side bending towards the load. There's a great amount of force that can be generated from compressed water and air. That's why our cars use hydraulic brakes. That's why we use a hydraulic jack to lift our car and not a seesaw. That's why we have pneumatic drills to bust up concrete. There is a lot of energy that can be harnessed from the compression of water and air. It only makes sense that our body would use some of those same principles in order to generate force and restrict movement in a certain direction. So the location of fluid within our body can create or restrict movement. Another thing to consider is simply the amount of fluid within our body. So the more fluid that is housed within our trunk, whether that's air in our lungs or water or fat in our gut, simply the more fluid that is packed within our structure, the less compliant the structure will be to shape change. So an easy way to demonstrate this is if I were to take a big breath of air in, and I really suck as much air in as I possibly can, and then I don't let any air out, and then I try to look over my shoulder. and I can't rotate very far. But if I take that big breath of air in, rotate to end range, and then let the air out, it allows me to rotate much further. This could be demonstrated in a water bottle. So if I were to put as much air into this bottle as I possibly could, and then I were attempt to bend or twist this bottle in any direction, you could see that it would be very resistant to shape change. Whereas if I let some air out of the bottle, now I can twist and bend this bottle in really any direction that I please. So not only location, but also the amount of fluid within our body can dictate how well we can move, how many degrees of freedom that we can express. So now that we have an appreciation for how our internal fluids affect our movement, how can we manipulate the amount of fluid in our body as well as the location of fluid within our body? Two main ways that I think we can manipulate these internal fluids are with respiratory training and with exercise position. So in regards to respiratory training, balloon breathing can be really popular. I'm not going to demonstrate balloon breathing here. I'll try to post a link somewhere in the video here. But why balloon breathing can be really helpful is it helps clients achieve an end range exhalation. So getting as much air out as they possibly can. The less air that's within our trunk, the more pliable it is. And secondly, because there is less fluid within our trunk cavity at end range exhalation, and because our abs are strongly recruited during an end exhalation, it helps decrease the compliance of our abdominal region. So my rib cage is made of bone, my low back is made of bone with some pretty big low back muscles, and my pelvis is obviously made out of bone, which means that the abdominal wall is going to be the least resistant to shape change, or the least likely to not give in to the expansion of the water and air within our trunk cavity. So if my abdominals are in a good position or aren't strong enough to resist expansion, anytime I breathe in or I try to move water from one side of my body to the other, I'm not going to be able to do it because all the water just moves forward into my gut. So I really need to have strong abdominals to be able to push the water into my body and also be able to shift it and move it side to side, up and down, front and back. I need a very strong abdominal wall in order to do that. So respiratory training, specifically sometimes using a balloon, can be very helpful. It's not that clients have to walk around with a balloon in their mouth or exercise with a balloon all the time. This is just a good teaching tool to help show clients that, this is the rib cage and ab position that I'm looking for. This is what an end range exhalation feels like. All the balloon breathing is a teaching tool initially. The second way, or the way to manipulate fluid location within our body, is actually exercise position. So we'll talk about the air in our lungs first. When we're standing on our feet, the base of the lungs are actually preferentially ventilated in comparison to the apex of our lungs. This is just a more efficient process. If I ventilate the bottom of my lungs, my heart doesn't have to pump as much blood up against gravity, so it's much more efficient to preferentially ventilate the bottom of my lungs at rest than the top. I can actually increase the amount of ventilation at the top of my lungs by doing a handstand. What that would do is now the apex of my lung is the lowest in regards to gravity, and so I can actually improve the ventilation and expansion of the top of my lungs by simply inverting and doing something like a handstand. The same thing happens with fluid displacement. So if you do a headstand, your face turns really red as all the blood rushes to your face. The same thing that happens with lung ventilation happens with the water inside our body as well as the internal organs. So if this water bottle, if the cap is my head and the bottom is my feet, when I'm in standing, gravity is pulling my water and internal organs down towards the ground. Now, if I lay on one side, or let's say I'm laying on my back rather, my guts actually flip up out of my pelvis and further up towards my rib cage. There's actually been a lot of research done on this in regards to radiation studies, because when radiologists or medical professionals are providing radiation treatments, they want to make sure not to expose healthy tissue to the radiation. So they need to understand how organ position is affected when someone is standing versus laying on their back versus laying on their side. And so when people go from standing to laying on their back, their internal organs can actually translate superiorly up towards the rib cage and head as much as 20 millimeters. So if we lay on our back, then more fluid collects on the back side of our body. If we do a headstand, more fluid collects, our head, neck, and upper rib cage. And if we lay on one side, then more fluid would collect on that lowest side. So if I was laying on my right, more fluid would collect on the right side of my body. So the two ways that we can manipulate the internal fluids within our body, we can manipulate the amount of fluid within our body with respiratory training, and we can manipulate the location of fluid within our body by changing exercise position, as well as helping to make sure that our abdominals are able to effectively resist expansion from the water and air inside our trunk. So now that we can appreciate how the amount of fluid and location can affect someone's movement capabilities, I'd like to review a push-up, a squat, and a split squat to go over how the internal fluid displacement affects people's ability to complete these exercises. So we've all seen what a poor push-up looks like. So this is their feet, their hips, their shoulders, and head. And you can see that, and we've all seen this, someone that does a really poor push-up, what happens? They get a big arch in their back, their chest and stomach falls down towards the floor. So if we were to take this water bottle and tip it forward, like if we're on all fours, all the water collects at the front of my body. And if I'm not strong enough to be able to resist that fluid, the expansive elements moving towards the front of my body, then I'm going to end up doing this sort of banana push-up. So what I actually consider a optimal push-up setup now is when people can actually maintain slight flexion throughout their back. What this indicates is that they are strong enough to resist the fluid pushing the front side of their body apart, and that they're actually strong enough to be able to push the fluid backwards. Now, if clients aren't strong enough to be able to do a push-up in this position, there are obviously regressions that could include elevating someone's hands, shortening the lever arm, so having them bend their hips and knees, or even using like something like a slingshot where the load on the arms and chest would be slightly decreased. next is a squat. So if we're looking at something like a squat that you would see in Olympic weightlifting, where they're squatting ass to grass, where they're essentially trying to sit on their heels, you can say that the goal of this movement is to be able to bring our knees up to our chest. Now, what does a poor squat look like, or who has a really tough time being able to squat to full depth like this? Well, people that really strongly arch their back and push their hips behind them. So, people that look like this when they squat. What this position does is if I strongly arch my back and dump my hips forward, what happens is I'm pushing fluid to the front side of my body. Now I have a large column of water and air that won't allow my knees to move towards my chest in order to squat to full depth. So again, there are modifications that you can make to the squatting activity, whether that's putting a load in front of the body, elevating the heels, any of those alterations to the exercise can allow people to maintain a little bit more of an upright torso, which will allow them more easily to squat to full depth because now there isn't a large column of fluid in the way. All right, so the last exercise we'll go over will be the split squat. So this is going to be a bird's eye view of the split squat. So this is left, right, right. Okay, so this is a split squat example with my left foot in front and my right foot behind. And in this example, my front hip is actually an external rotation because my right hip is behind my left. So my left hip is externally rotated. You can tell that by the obtuse angle here at the front hip. In this middle example, you would say that the hip is maybe in neutral rotation or zero rotation. That's indicated by the 90-degree angle here. And then this last example is with the left hip in internal rotation. So now the angle at my front hip is acute. So many times, in order to progress from this hip externally rotated position to an internally rotated position, we need to be able to push fluid back on the left and push fluid forward on the right. You can see as someone's ability to push fluid back on the left and forward on the right improves, that would be what allows them to do a split squat with internal rotation about their front hip. Unfortunately, not many clients can start at this position, so initially clients may have to do a split squat with like a cable machine, a strap wrapped around their low back where the cable's pulling the hips forward just to get them something to push back against in order to keep their abdominals engaged and to keep their head stacked over their shoulders. It's really important to avoid excessive spinal extension if the goal is to be able to rotate, because when the spine extends, it moves towards what we call the closed packed position, where that is where the fewest degrees of freedom are allowed. So it's really important to first try to get the head stacked over the hips. That is what will allow the rotation to occur. So usually the first step is just trying to get the pelvis and head stacked on top of one another. Once they do that, then you're able to progress towards having them move into hip internal rotation at the front leg. You could achieve this by having them try to do a split squat with their right knee, with their left knee right underneath their right elbow. But again, the point of this is in order for us to be able to achieve hip internal rotation at the front leg, we need to be able to push fluid backwards on that left side. All right, so that is just an abbreviated version of the lecture that I'll be giving at The Ohio State University later this afternoon. In conclusion, kind of long story short here, we need both compressive and expansive elements in order for our body to be able to move. The muscles provide the contractile elements, bones, water, and air all provide the expansive elements. As we've demonstrated so far today, the amount and location of fluid within the body can be a restriction to someone moving in that direction. So before simply prescribing someone stretches from range of motion limitation, I'd encourage people to first try to analyze the amount and location of fluid within the body or joint space. Secondly, as we've demonstrated that the body is maybe best represented by a tensegrity structure rather than a series of levers and pulleys. Try not to coach exercise as if the body is made up of straight lines, 90-degree angles, levers, and pulleys. The body's meant to bend, twist, and rotate. So I really challenge you, if you prescribe exercise, try to find ways to be able to safely load people in rotation in anything other than straight lines and 90-degree angles. So hopefully this was helpful. If you guys have any questions, comment below, send me an email. If you guys watch the video this long, I really appreciate your time and attention.